So you've measured your quilt backing and you've measured your quilt top, just to realize that your quilt backing is big enough, but it's not quite big enough for the long arm frame. Here are 3 tips to help you quilt that quilt even with a backing that's a little bit too small. Before I even start loading my quilt, I always measure my quilt top vertically and horizontally through the center, and I write those measurements down. Then I take my backing and I do the same thing, and I write that number down. Then I compare both of the measurements to make sure that I'm going to have enough. For this quilt, I wrote those numbers down. So my quilt top measures 57 inches by 58 inches, and my quilt backing measures 60 inches by 61 inches, which is not big enough for the long arm frame. If you're domestic quilting, you could probably make this work a lot easier, but for long arming, it's not as simple. For anybody who's working in a business situation, I actually have a line for all of these measurements on the back of my intake form. If you want a copy of this, or even just to look at it to get some ideas for your own intake form, you can get a copy of this on my website. So I'm gonna link that below. Tip number 1, pin it. I use red snappers usually when I load my quilts, but as you can see down this barrel, it actually takes up a lot more fabric than pinning does. So if I need to have just even an extra ½ inch or 1 inch on a quilt backing, I'll pin the quilt if I have to. Tip number 2 is to find some strips of fabric laying around your studio and sew these along the backing. And that way you can still utilize your side clamps to add that much needed side tension. Tip number 3, add some leaders of your own. So I have these long pieces of fabric in my studio, and I use a long basting stitch along the top of my real backing, and that way I can use this material to roll onto the take-up bar and the belly bar and still be able to fit the quilt onto the backing. But what if you've already started quilting this quilt? What do you do now? Well, unfortunately, if you've already started quilting, the only thing you can do now is to add extra backing. So I'm gonna link a video to show you how to do that, because here we measure everything.